Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 155 of Lucretius Today. We're continuing to discuss chapter 7 of Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. This chapter is entitled The Canon, Reason, and Nature. We got started with it last week, and the big topic of the chapter is the relationship between the canon, reason, and nature in terms of setting up an ultimate standard of deciding what's true, what's false, how to begin the analysis of just about any question. And the first subsection is entitled The Dethronement of Reason. Throughout this chapter, DeWitt's main point is that Epicurus, in contrast to Plato, Aristotle, many of the other Greek philosophers, decided that ultimately an abstract perspective or abstract version of reason or logic cannot ultimately be the guide or the standard of truth. As stated in the Principal Doctrines, Epicurus says that the wise man is going to live his life by reason. So while Epicurus is never anti-reason, or at least anti a particular form of reason, he does come down against the idea that reason alone in the abstract, and the phrase that we've been using in recent weeks, pure reason contemplating absolute truth, a kind of deification of a disembodied reason or logic, which the other schools had begun to convey, that there's something almost magical about reason that can allow us to reach another dimension, reach an area of forms, as Plato might have put it, or determine what essences are, as Aristotle might have said, or just to put us in contact with some other but truer world than the one in which we live in. And Epicurus is, throughout his philosophy, looking at that kind of contention that the prior philosophers had taken and gone in a different direction, saying that nature, through the faculties that nature has given to us, is ultimately the standard and not just our own human reasoning. We'll be going into the details of the three elements of the canon in the next chapter. But again, for the time being, we're talking about this general relationship and the general perspective, the big picture here being that humans using logic do not in and of themselves have anything that should be considered magical or supernatural or the ability to go further than ultimately can be verified through the senses. All of the things I'm saying could be said much better, I'm sure, and the way I'm saying is probably not the best way, but it's clearly a very, very interesting aspect of Epicurean philosophy that we need to be sure we hit hard and talk about as we go further.
So one thing I picked up on last week after we were recording, and we talked a little bit about this on the forum, is this issue of whether canonics can be associated with very specific words like a test of truth or a standard against which you measure other things to see if they are true. And I bring that up by way of preface because when we get into the issue of reason here, I want to read something Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Peter Carr. He says, "Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." So if we accept what I was thinking could be true, which is that a canon of epistemology, which is something that you measure other things against to see if they are true, if that's the case, then it seems to me that Jefferson here is making a strong case to put reason in that position. So hopefully we can, by the end of maybe this episode, come up with some good reasons why Epicurus is taking a different course on that.
Or if he's taking a different course on that. I'm not entirely sure that he is taking a different course on that. other than the fact that it may seem that way due to our definitions, which is probably the place we should have started today anyway. What is reason? I think most of us, when we talk about nature, although any word we want to talk about, we can come up with all sorts of rabbit holes to chase down. But I think probably we all have largely a consensus on what nature means, that there's something out there separately and totally apart from us. The universe itself doesn't look to me or to you to tell it what to do. It was there before we came. It's going to be there after we're gone. And it's possible to talk pretty intelligently about nature. But reason, what exactly is reason? And should we consider the word reason to be the equivalent of the word logic? Is it the equivalent of the term dialectical logic or dialectical reason? Diogenes Laertius says that Epicurus rejected dialectic. What's the best way to get at the meaning of these terms? So when we're talking today about the relationship between nature versus reason, what are we really talking about as reason?
I'm looking at definitions here, and the first definition is a cause, explanation, or justification for an action or event. The second definition probably is the one we're more interested in. The power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. That would be, I would say, the classical definition of reason as ancient philosophers would have applied it to epistemology.
Does that mean that the working definition there would be is that reason is that thought process which is based on logic? Because if so, we're going to, of course, immediately ask for the definition of the word logic.
I don't know if I would say that there's a one-to-one correlation here. I'm a bit fuzzy around the edges on this one, but I do feel like there's a difference between these two words. But you're right, it is difficult to get at the heart of the issue.
When you talk about that first definition, that takes me back to Frances Wright in A Few Days in Athens. She'll talk about the tracing of causes back and back and back and back, and that is an important part of the process. But that causation often doesn't mean a whole lot more than following in time. It seems one event seems to lead to another in a way that we call it as the cause and so forth. But probably it is that second one you're talking about that we need to focus on. So if it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but if logic is tightly tied up into reason, would it be accurate or fair to say that Epicurus dethroned logic as his ultimate test of truth? I think all of us kind of resist that conclusion, but to what extent is it true and what is it false?
Well, ultimate test of truth is an interesting concept because I think Epicurus would maybe present it slightly differently. The standard of truth is almost superficial in a sense. It's something that is outward facing and is taking in new information, testing it against known information. With the senses, you're constantly streaming in through every sense. And so to talk about an ultimate standard of truth, I guess I just don't know how that fits in exactly.
Well, if what we're talking about is how we as individuals decide whether something is true or false, like you say, it's outward facing. It's not like we're saying that truth exists floating in the atmosphere somewhere. What we're presuming in this conversation is that truth is our understanding of something accurately in a way that we consider to be true. So it's something that's really going on in our head, as opposed to, again, not floating out there in the air. Is there any truth out there in the air, Joshua or Martin or Calasini? Or is truth something that's just within our minds?
That one is only in our minds, because it's a word which we created to designate something, and there is no absolute existence of this outside of our minds.
I think that's correct, from the direction that Epicurus is coming from anyway. And again, keeping the big picture in perspective, we're contrasting this to the way that we understand Plato or Aristotle might have suggested it, which is that the senses are deceptive, the senses are insufficient, and that we can go beyond our senses to discover something to be true against the senses or beyond what they can ever establish to be the case. This is all very, very complicated material, but what does it come down to in the end to you guys? DeWitt's talking about dethroning That would imply that he's talking about a king and deciding who ultimately makes the decision as to whether you consider something to be true or false. Is it something you can get independent of the senses and independent of nature?
For the record, I would say the canon is how we interface directly with sort of the factual basis of the reality that we're living in. That's certainly a way that I would describe the senses. You could describe the feelings in that way. And once again, the prolepsis is something I'm always confused about. Where I think reason, logic, these things come into the equation is at a later point. This is why I latched onto the word ultimate earlier, because I feel like it's almost the reverse, that the most proximate to us, I guess, in our approach to these things are precisely the canon, and that reason is down the chain somewhere else. That reason needs information that has been passed through the canon or verified by the canon in order to have something to work on. That's my sense.
Why don't we just go ahead and deal with on page 123, where he says, quote, "It will have been noted that the canon makes no mention of reason. This means that reason is denied rank as a criterion of truth. It will be worthwhile to observe by what procedure this exclusion may be justified and what the consequence will be for the concept of reason itself. The position of Epicurus becomes seemingly paradoxical because there is no instrumentality by which reason can be dethroned except reason itself. Consideration of this paradox may be postponed until it's been shown how the Platonic concept of reason may be rendered absurd. The conclusions will be absolutely logical if the premises are accepted." What do you take that to mean?
I think that DeWitt is right here to touch on a fundamental difficulty when we approach this issue. Because in order to pass judgment on reason, it requires the thinking faculty to do that. The senses can't pass judgment on reason, in other words. It's not sufficient for them to do that. It takes that part of your mind which weighs things against other things and considers them. And it's that part of the mind that he's touching on here, which is also the part of the mind that determines that itself is not directly epistemic, not directly canonical or a criterion.
Probably, in my mind, it's another question of the use of the word reason, because loosely speaking, I think we consider all of our thinking processes to be our reasoning processes. None of us would like to say that our thoughts are just random or unguided or just totally chaotic. We tend to think of whatever it is we conclude, we think of that as our reasoning.
Yeah, but if you formulate like this, like you and Joshua said, then it's quite obvious that logic and thereby reason are part of the prolepsis. They are not really dethroned. They become part of prolepsis anticipation, something like that.
They're certainly part of the process of being conscious and weighing and balancing and coming to any kind of a conclusion at all. I tend to think that the issue is dividing that process up into the data gathering part of the process versus the weighing part of the process. And it's the weighing part of the process where errors.
I said versus the process part of the process.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that reason, logic, these things all have their place. The reason they are, quote unquote, dethroned in the sense that DeWitt is describing here is because they are not part of the way that we directly interface with, call it what you want. I would probably prefer facts to myself, to capital T truth, but they're not unimportant. Reason and logic, just because they've been taken out of the canon, that does not necessarily render them completely irrelevant and unimportant. One way we could maybe talk about this productively, and I'm probably going to need your help here, Cassius, because you will remember this letter, kind of ironically, this other letter from Thomas Jefferson. It starts out, "I return always to my perpetual anodyne," or something like that.
Yes, it's Jefferson's letter to John Adams of August the 15th of 1820. He says, "But enough of criticism. Let me turn to your puzzling letter of May the 12th on matter, spirit, motion, etc. Its crowd of skepticisms kept me from sleep. I read it and laid it down, read it and laid it down again and again. And to give rest to my mind," here's the important part, "I was obliged to recur ultimately to my habitual anodyne. Quote, I feel, therefore I exist. I feel bodies which are not myself. There are other existences then. I call them matter. I feel them changing place. This gives me motion. Where there is an absence of matter, I call it void or nothing or immaterial space. On the basis of sensation, of matter and motion, we may erect the fabric of all the certainties we can have or need. That type of orientation to reality, again, it's that distinction with Descartes. I think, therefore I am. He's placing thought at the center as opposed to Jefferson saying that I feel, therefore I exist. And he's talking about feelings or, again, the senses as the ultimate starting point, foundation of the analysis. We're not challenging the process of analysis. You have to have a process of analysis. The question is, what do you ultimately base that analysis on?
Yeah. You picked up on directly where I was going with that. We kind of, in a separate conversation, got really deep into the weeds with Descartes and those issues. So I'm happy to see you've been able to rather succinctly express that, because now I don't have to. But I think you're very much on the right track there, which is that in the one case, in Descartes' case, he's taking, I think, therefore I am. It's very much taking a mental process and putting that first in the what will become a chain of reasoning, whereas in Thomas Jefferson's case, he's taking not a mental process, but a data gathering aspect of human nature and putting that first. That seems to me to be the crucial difference.
Yes. And Joshua, another illustration I think that fits right in here is the one everybody knows about, again, Plato's cave analogy. In my weak understanding of Plato, that is what I continually come back to as maybe one of the most important aspects of it. Are you chained in a cave, and are your senses part of this terrible situation that you're in where your mind is just unable through the senses to gain any sense of truth whatsoever, and that it has to be freed from this cave implicitly through this appeal to an abstract logic and abstract reason that is not chained to your senses, that can lead you out of the cave to a higher reality? That picture that Plato has drawn with that cave, I think, is really critical and is really a good place for us to contrast what Epicurus is doing, because I think he's rejecting that analogy, he's rejecting that illustration, and saying that your senses and these canonical faculties, the senses, anticipations, and feelings, they're not chains that are constantly lying to you. They are, in fact, what you ultimately have to look to come up with what is true to you. There is no world outside the cave that you can ascend to through absolute logic and syllogisms and the mind working upon itself. You are an integrated creature of senses and thought is not chained and restrained by the senses. It is, in fact, the senses and the way you interface with the world that is your whole life, which takes you back to principal doctrine 2. That death is the absence of sensation, and anything that's without sensation is nothing to us. I think ultimately Epicurus would say that pure reason, contemplating absolute truth, that's nothing to us unless we have connections through the senses. On page 124, I see this line from DeWitt that I think is probably fairly consistent with what we're thinking. He says, quote, "While by this line of argument, the Epicurean line of argument, it will be observed that the incorporeal, eternal, and unerring reason of Plato and Aristotle is eliminated, the purely human mortal reason remains. But even this is subordinated to the sensations." Quote, "The basic idea is the conviction that reason is incapable of making direct contact with reality. Reason is active only when the sensations are active. Without the sensations, reason possesses no criteria, since they, along with the anticipations and feelings, function as contacts with reality."
Okay, yeah, what you just read there would summarize my entire thinking on this whole section in this chapter. That was a good way to express it. At the bottom of page 123, just to get this in the record, it's just more on the same point. He's talking about how the 12 principles relate to the Platonic conception of reason. And one of them that he quotes is, "The atoms are always in motion. If we seek the implied negative of this positive statement, and Epicurus does reason after this fashion, it will be this: that nothing else in the universe is in motion, because the void is incapable of motion, and outside of atoms and void there is nothing. And he concludes that by saying it will be nonsensical, therefore, to think of divine reason as the cause of motion.
DeWitt often refers to sequences of propositions like that as chain reasoning, and that's absolutely reasoning. So it's nonsensical to say that Epicurus is against reasoning or against logic. It's just a question of where you start, where the data for logic comes from, and whether logic can go off on its own apart from data.
Then at the top of page 124, this is something, I don't know if I'm just supremely ignorant on this point or if other people are going to be as surprised as me, but there's an interestingly phrased sentence at the very top of 124. DeWitt says, to Epicurus, it meant that the idea of primeval chaos was absurd. The universe has always been a cosmos. Before I looked this up, I thought universe, cosmos, I thought these were the same thing. But when I looked up the definition of the word cosmos, a cosmos is a universe seen as a well-ordered whole. And for me, I had no idea that extra layer was added on there. So one thing I brought up on the thread, I think in conversation with Don on this issue, is that when he says the universe has always been a cosmos in this definition is basically the opposite of chaos. If you're talking about a cosmos as a well-ordered whole, there's no place for chaos in that. So that's something I latched onto as being interesting. And then he goes on further with there. He says, to him, the universe was a cosmos solely because of the various weights, shapes, and magnitudes of the atoms and their motions, all of which were constant factors. Of course, this is ancient Greece. They don't have a theory of gravity. They don't have all of these important physical conclusions that we've developed, particularly in the last 200 or 300 years. So it's not surprisingly that we're running into a very alien universe when we read about this stuff, but it is nevertheless very interesting. And he concludes all of that by saying, consequently, there was no need of the ordering mind or nous, according to Anaxagoras, or of the divine demiurge of Plato. Both of these become absurdities. In the extant remains of Epicurus, the word nous, which is a Greek word, does not occur. It seems to have been deliberately avoided, which certainly makes sense. There's no mind outside the universe, which is putting things in order and making sure they run correctly. It would be a mistake to think along those lines, is the conclusion that we get here.
A lot of what Epicurus is doing all the way through is looking at what people allege to be an ordered system as if it had a person who ordered it behind it. And he's looking at these regularities and attempting to explain where they came from. And so the Epicurean response to the assertion that it came from a divine creator is that it did not need a divine creator, because the nature of the atoms and the void will give rise to the things that we see without a superintending creative force behind it. And in the letter to Herodotus, he talks about that the regular motions of the stars, I think is the example, the different things that we see are regular, have really been set in motion from the foundation of the world. Cosmos is not the same as the world, and you got to get into the definition of what Epicurus refers to as a world and relate that to the universe, because the universe contains limitless numbers of worlds, I think, in the Epicurean viewpoint, but that the way the worlds form sets in motion a determined series of events in most things from the time it was first formed. Joshua, have I taken the wrong direction with that? Is that even an intelligent comment on what you said? I was confused when you were talking. I was thinking the word world instead of cosmos.
Yeah. That's certainly an interesting point that has to be brought up anytime you talk about the Epicurean understanding of nature, is that you've got worlds. And I don't really have a good way to conceptualize this. There are people on our forum who I don't entirely disagree with, who will conceptualize this by talking about like star systems or galaxies. Like that's a world. But it's clear to me that I can't see Epicurus being that knowledgeable about the precise configuration of the way things were in the universe. And the idea that the physical gods who are made of atoms and void are living in what we would call outer space, in the space between the worlds, the intermundia. So that to me is interesting. What's more interesting to me is this. But you mentioned one very good thing, which is this idea of how do you systematically remove the argument for the supernatural from this world. So that's one problem. The other thing is this issue of chaos. And we'll remember we talked about this in previous episodes on this series, chaos was the first philosophical issue on record that Epicurus responds to. He responds to this when he's a young boy in school. He's exasperated that his teachers cannot explain to him what chaos is. Here's the problem. Epicurus believes that the universe, in all its particulars, at some point, at some level of knowledge, is thoroughly explicable and understandable. I think that's quite important. Do you agree with that sentence, Cassius?
I guess the part that concerns me is whether explicable means that humans at some point have the ability to comprehend it all. And the limitation that concerns me is I think that by definition, if the universe is infinite in size and eternal in time, by definition, a human being is never going to be able to encompass all knowledge of it. If you're saying it's potentially explicable as we gather more data, I would agree with that. When you ask me whether I agree with it or not, what are you thinking is the potential controversy about it?
Well, now that you reply that, I'm actually starting to think a little bit differently about this. Maybe I should phrase the question like this. Everything in the universe can be explained eventually if we have enough knowledge. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's the way I would prefer to put it.
And it can be explained in natural terms. It's almost as if we, again, got this definition issue of supernatural, as if the bright line here seems to be that there is no reason to expect at any point, no matter how long we live or how far we fly through the universe, we're going to run into anything that's not a part of the universe itself and is not therefore natural. And you can say that that's a word game if you want to, but if it exists in the sense of being able to touch it or see it or come into contact with it, then that's going to make it natural. Maybe you are going to come into contact at some point with some space alien who says that I came to Earth 10 million years ago and planted the seeds of human life on the Earth. Maybe that's the case because we're going to go to Mars and other places soon and other systems at some point and do exactly that. But if we were to come into contact with that Star Trek-like figure who says I planted life on Earth 10 million years ago, he'd be natural. It would not be anything supernatural if we came into contact with that. So that's the distinction that I think seems important to make, is that we don't have all the data we want. We're never going to have all the data we want. But we're making this logical conclusion that this data that we don't have is not going to be supernatural.
Right. Okay. So that seems to me to be the critical difference between a sort of a generic universe and a cosmos. A cosmos is something that is well ordered and can be explained eventually. If you have all the information. The problem here that he's really getting into is this issue in Greek cosmology or cosmogony or whatever you want to call it, of chaos. That's what I want to focus on, because chaos is something that cannot be explained, that has no explanatory power. No inferences can be drawn from it. It doesn't really mean anything. So for people to put that at the start of their system, it's, in my mind at least, equivalent of throwing their hands in the air and saying, I have no idea what's going on here. Because part of what it takes, the issue of chaos, it seems to me that the universe that originates in primordial chaos, what does that require? Because chaos will always be chaos. That's my assumption. But what it would require to make the transition from chaos to cosmos, in the view of, I think, most theologically sound Greeks, would be an ordering mind. That's the distinction.
Okay. So when you say order, you are inseparably including an orderer in that terminology. You're saying that implies necessarily that it was ordered by some outside force beyond itself.
No. I wouldn't say that exactly.
Okay.
If because Epicurus cosmos is ordered. He makes the claim that it has always been like that forever, right? So that is, I think, a self-sustaining idea.
Or that it's always been the same eternal atoms and void, and these eternal atoms and void have always had the same properties and capacities to combine in particular ways that they have now. That there's never been any new atoms from outside the universe or no change in the nature of the atoms that have given them any new capacities to combine in ways that they could not have combined in an infinite number of times in the past. But the source of what we're calling order is not an external force, but it's just the nature of the atoms, that they have this capacity to naturally come into combinations that we consider to be ordered.
Yeah, Joshua mentioned earlier, referring to a particular cosmos, we can in principle know everything. And this is, I think, already too optimistic. So even if we just restrict us on a single cosmos, we can never have sufficient information to completely predict or explain it. But of course, what I agree is there is no supernatural thing which comes out. It's just that we are limited in how we can figure out the laws of nature to give complete explanation in every case.
What is that limitation? Is it just a matter of not having enough time? And if you had enough time, you could? Or is there something else that's the limitation?
The limitation is that there are too many particles. So you cannot track every particle independently. So that prevents it, that you can really explain it from first principles. And if you go then to, but this is now not contained in Epicurus, so this is what we think through when we derive from it, so that we have then emergent properties. But when we deal with emergent properties, especially those which the higher orders they go, then we have a lot of uncertainties in there. Their behavior is established empirically and not explained back thoroughly by first principles.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think it's clear from the letter to Epicurus that Epicurus doesn't know everything. He can't explain everything. He knows that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that he would say that if he had enough information on a particular thing, then he could explain it. That's where I'm at, I guess, is my sense of it. I'm mainly bringing this up to draw a distinction between the idea of a well-ordered universe and a universe that starts in chaos. Because to me, chaos is whatever else it is, it's not explainable. It cannot be explained.
And that's what DeWitt is saying here, right, Joshua? Is that the whole idea of chaos is absurd. We can call flotsam floating on the ocean after a shipwreck, we can call that chaotic if we like, but ultimately it's not chaotic. What's going on is deriving from the properties of the atoms and the void that's involved in that particular part of the ocean where that flotsam and jetsam is floating. What do you think of that?
Yeah, you're definitely on the right track. So I kind of said something I may not have expressed very well earlier, but in Greek cosmology, everything begins in chaos. To get from a universe of chaos, however long it's been in chaos, I don't know if that's ever addressed, to get from a universe that exists in a state of chaos to a universe that exists as an ordered cosmos, it seems to me that chaos would be self-sustaining, as in the same way that an ordered universe would be self-sustaining. And that, therefore, if you're going to make a change from chaos to cosmos, what that requires is something outside, whereas something that has always been a cosmos doesn't require anything from outside. Have I explained that better? If you start with chaos, it seems to me that you need that ordering mind, or that nous, or the divine demiurge, or whatever. There's got to be something to make that change.
And that's the essential point here that Epicurus is making, is that this idea of chaos is absurd. Or
Yes.
Is there chaos in an Epicurean universe? This kind of attaches also to I always talk about this A.A. Long article on chance and natural law and Epicureanism. This issue of, is it even conceivable is there ever any part of an Epicurean universe that you would really consider to be chaotic? There's this term of chaos, which I think you're right, that the Greeks were focusing on. It's like the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, with the implication that everything before that was without, what does it say? Oh my gosh, I can't believe I've forgotten my Genesis, but does Genesis use the word chaos?
Without form and void.
Without form, basically, I would think means basically that point.
That's one of the definitions as well. The formless matter supposed to have existed before the creation of the universe. Formless matter.
You're postulating through your mind this condition that we have absolutely no evidence has ever existed. Everything we see is a result of atoms and void moving together, that when we study, we can make sense of it naturally through science. But for some reason, people think that they can, through their logical mind, suggest to you that you should accept that there was a time before this happened, before nature was the way nature is. And why would you ever accept that?
That's the question.
I mean, I think it's an interesting way to think about it, is why would you ever accept a possibility that you can think about and can speculate all day long that, oh yes, maybe there was a time before the universe was the way it is now, and maybe there was a time of absolute chaos. But that's just idle speculation unless you've got some evidence to support it, or some reasoning based on evidence that would allow you to reach that conclusion. And just because there may be a period after an explosion of a star or something where everything is splattered all about in a particular way that we don't think looks particularly pretty, that doesn't mean that that splattering of matter after the star has exploded is chaotic. The star has exploded as a result of natural properties of the star, and the explosion leads it out into ways that we don't have the ability to, as Martin was saying, we don't have the scientific ability to see individual atoms moving around and predict where they're going to go at a particular moment, but they're not being directed by some demon.
I have some side remarks here. One is it does actually look quite pretty. If you look at those pictures astronomers take, a star explosion, so a supernova or something, that does look extremely pretty. No? So it doesn't look well ordered if we look at it from another. But it truly, to the human eye, it's very aesthetic. No? So from the pictures we can generate from it. So that is one thing. And the other thing, what was mentioned there, characterizing this chaos, there is actually an analogy between the very early phase of the universe, where we did not have individual atoms, but everything was essentially a mix-up of quarks. And plus, of course, then the electrons must have existed inside there already as well. But it would have been very difficult to distinguish individual things like what we call now an atom. So all these elementary particles were condensed into an extreme ball, into one thing, something like a giant nucleus, but very small. No? Giant just because of the number of particles in principle in there, but extremely small.
But you're postulating that, Martin, based on a scientific extrapolation of what we know about the way matter and energy and atoms and so forth work. You're postulating it based on data from the senses that we've collected over time that in a rational extrapolation would lead to a condition such as you're describing. You're not at any point in that process inserting a supernatural God to say, yes, all these things took place exactly as we would have predicted them, but exactly 10 gazillion years ago, some supernatural force came from nowhere and all of a sudden put everything into motion. There's no reason to ever, no matter how far back you go or how far you trace your causation analysis, there's never any reason to try to just explode the whole analysis by suggesting a supernatural outside force.
I should point out here that one thing DeWitt isolates as being a feature of a cosmos and not of a chaotic universe is that in a cosmos, there are constant factors. That's a word he uses on the top of page 124, constant factors. In this hot, dense state that you're describing, Martin, would you say that there are still constant factors in play? Because if chaos is complete disorder, as the traditional definition is, then any amount of order at all would suddenly render it not chaos. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, of course. So I mentioned it only as an analogy. Actually, the way they have used chaos in the ancient world is not specific enough that you can really get much out of it, and that's why it's essentially useless. So that part I agree, but just the way it was formulated, there is an interesting analogy between that view of chaos and this very early stage of the universe.
Very good. I'm happy with that issue for now.
I think we've hit that hard enough, probably.
And the conclusion of it all is in the next paragraph, the top of the next paragraph. He says, "It will be observed that the incorporeal, eternal, and unerring reason of Plato and Aristotle is eliminated, and the purely human and mortal reason remains." This is, Cassius, what you quoted earlier. Now, further down in that same paragraph, there's something else that I've highlighted here, which is this phrase, it's about in the middle of the page, where it says, "Reason is active only when the sensations are active." What do we think about that?
Maybe just the major point is that reason doesn't operate unless it has data from the sensations to operate on. Does reason itself operate on itself?
One thing I've mentioned in separate conversations we've had is that I can't even get my head around this idea of a mind with no sense organ feeding information into it. I can't wrap my brain around that. So of course I'm going to say, well, of course reason is active only when the sensations are active, because when the sensations aren't active, you're dead. I mean, that's going to be the rather cheeky takeaway there. But yeah, I just don't know.
This is such deep stuff that I don't think we can make much sense of it. But I do think as a general observation, there are people who seem to talk about consciousness and the mind and just simply being conscious of itself. Consciousness conscious only of itself. The mind thinking only of itself or whatever. And I think that is a very problematic suggestion. Martin, you have anything to say about that? The issue of what it would mean for consciousness to be conscious. It gets back to what we were talking about a minute ago on the Jefferson thing about I feel, therefore I exist, versus the Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Can a mind be conscious only of itself? Is that just such a logical abstraction that it's meaningless and should be rejected? Or what do you think about that?
It will not be possible to verify this experimentally. So what we would need, something where even if that hypothetical brain doesn't have any sense input, at least it must have some outputs that we can detect what it does. And then it may actually produce something like cogito ergo sum, but then we don't know whether this was just some chance nonsense or whether it actually produced it to some consciousness process. So that means it will practically, from a practical aspect, not be possible to verify that this hypothetic brain has consciousness.
This is what I would say. Martin, thinking about what you just said, this is where in the past and when I was in college, I would hear people in philosophy courses talking about stuff like that. And it would be just about at this point in the conversation that I would just force myself to walk out of the room and say, this is nonsense. It leads to nothing. It's a waste of time. And it's never going to lead to anything productive in my life at all to chase rabbit holes like whether a consciousness can be conscious only of itself or not. And I have a tendency to think that that's a very unproductive, if not nonsensical, way to approach philosophy.
There was he actually majored in philosophy, came back from World War II, went to the University of New Mexico, I think, majored in philosophy, became a park ranger in Utah, wrote a very famous book among a certain group of people called Desert Solitaire. I actually really like this book. There's an interesting paragraph, which I'll try to summarize, in which he says that if you're dealing with a metaphysical idealist or someone of that stripe, the kind of person, Cassius, that you're describing in a philosophy class, Edward Abbey suggests that the remedy for that is to take them outside and throw a rock at their head. and if he ducks, he's a liar. You know, we're trying to deal with concrete reality here. I realize that philosophy has this whole other dimension. I also realize, frankly, I'm not very well versed in it. So I probably can't even talk intelligently about it if I tried. But it's also the case that I'm just not that interested in most of it.
Yes. Maybe there's a good reason you're not well versed in it. Maybe it's because you're smarter than that, or because you just instinctively, or you feel the lack of productivity of entertaining ideas without evidence. To me, maybe that's how I would summarize all those different arguments that I hear, like that consciousness contemplating only itself. Why do you ever spend time going there without some kind of evidentiary basis for the speculation? I mean, if you enjoy something, if you enjoy just that kind of thing, then sure, do it. But it's just like we were talking about earlier. Why would you ever postulate the existence of a supernatural creator or a time before the universe operates as it does now without any evidence? There's something just instinctively unsound about that approach.
The reason this occurred in humans is because there were things that were unexplainable, and then it was just too uncomfortable to not be able to explain things. So, for example, with weather phenomenon, this is attributed to, in ancient Greece, the gods are causing weather. Zeus is causing the lightning. And so much of life is caused because of these various Greek gods. So it's this explanation in order to deal with something that's ultimately not knowable at that point, because science did not exist, but people felt uncomfortable not knowing. So they created ideas to make sense of things. So there's this sort of need for the human being to make sense of things. But unfortunately, that leads to errors at times.
Yeah, that is certainly the case in the ancient world, to an extent in the modern world as well. In the ancient world, it was very much, it seemed to me to be more transactional in this life. You know, I'm getting on a boat, so I need to make an offering to Poseidon, that kind of thing. I could go into in here about how Lucretius talks about how lightning strikes the temples of Zeus himself. Maybe something that would be more interesting, because we've been talking about issues of deep philosophical issues, sometimes philosophical issues that some of us don't think are really worth pursuing. And it may surprise people to learn that one of my favorite authors is Henry David Thoreau. People read Henry David Thoreau and they emerge with the conclusion that he is the guy that Cassius was describing elsewhere. I don't think that's a completely unfair presentation, but what that represents, what Thoreau is for me, is not so much the metaphysical speculation that interests me so much as it is the use of metaphor that sort of bridges the gap between these two worlds in a more aesthetic way that I find interesting. But just for the record, he does say in his journal, "You must live in the present, launch yourself on every wave, find your eternity in each moment. Fools stand on their island of opportunities and look toward another land. There is no other land. There is no other life but this." I was quite gratified to find that in his journal back when I was in college or shortly after, because it tracks so clearly with something I've long felt. Now I'm completely off topic.
No, I think that is the topic. You use the word metaphor, and I think Lucretius talks about a scheme of contemplation, or at least some of the translators use that kind of terminology. I think that's what we're talking about everything we do here. We're looking for a picture, an outline, a method of putting everything into a context that's understandable to us, because if it's not understandable, ultimately, then we can't even deal with it at all. And we have to deal with this issue that we don't have all the information that we would like to have, and we will never have all the information we'd like to have. And to me, I keep coming back to that as the edge of the canyon. Do we jump out into the canyon hoping that something's going to save us, hoping that something supernatural is going to happen? Or do we pull back from jumping into that canyon, relying on our senses telling us that this is probably not going to lead to anything good to jump off into it? Maybe there are times when you do jump off into it if you've properly prepared a parachute or properly prepared somebody to catch you or something. But when you don't have the information that you would like to have, what do you do? Do you allow yourself to just indulge in flights of fancy that come to your mind as possibilities, but which you have no evidence to support? Or do you construct probabilities in your mind based on evidence that you do have? And if you think it's acceptable to just jump off the canyon edge and hope for the best, that's probably not a very wise thing to do.
So at the beginning of this conversation today, I kind of started with a challenge by reading this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I'll read it again and we'll see if we have any new thoughts or ideas, since we've been just talking about reason for most of the day. Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. One thing that occurs to me as I read this through the second time is he says, call to her tribunal every fact.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to imply that
what is a fact? What is a fact, though, Joshua? Is a fact your opinion about the fact? Is a fact a truth which your mind has concluded to be true, or your mind has concluded to be factual? Or is it the data itself?
It's a difficult question, the difference between fact and truth. I'm much less comfortable talking about truth generally. You know what we haven't really done here? Maybe
What's
this
that?
isn't the place for it. We've been having some very interesting conversations about, do the senses always tell us the truth? And you had some very interesting takes on that. But maybe have we discussed that recently on the podcast?
I don't know that we have, and it's certainly part of what we're talking about right now, because talking about the senses versus truth is almost like apples and oranges, in that truth is a product in our mind of working with the data the senses has given us, but the data is not necessarily even true or false unless you've evaluated it. Wouldn't that be right? All sensations are true is this phrase that certainly has come up a lot, and that we have to have an understanding. And that's where DeWitt goes into the long discussions of the various meanings of the word true and how the senses are witnesses who are reporting honestly. You know, the word honest versus true. You can honestly say that you saw something, but have very poor eyesight, and what you're reporting that you saw when you're on the witness stand is not what actually happened. So you've got this difference between the word true and what we're talking about with the senses. And every one of these canonical faculties, even the anticipations and sense of pleasure and pain, they're producing sensations to you that you have to accept as the starting point of your analysis. But as far as whether pronouncing them to be true or false or not, that's something different, I think, Epicurus is saying. I'm sorry, Joshua, I've led you off your train of thought.
I don't have a train of thought. I think it's an interesting question, because if we say that, you know, the whole topic today was the dethronement of reason, right? Reason taken out of the canon of epistemology and put in a secondary place. But if it's true that we can't establish anything as a fact without the application of reason, doesn't that just slide reason right back into place in the canon? That's the difficult question.
Yeah, what I'm reading DeWitt to be saying in his analysis of Epicurus here, and I think this goes back to Lucretius. I can't call the examples to mind right this second, but I think Lucretius is fairly regularly using the word true reason. And I don't think that Epicurus would for a minute admit that he is abandoning reason in a sense. What Epicurus seems to me to be saying here is that there is a true reason, a true method of reasoning, a method of reasoning that gets you to the truth, which is the kind of thought processes that we're familiar with and that we endorse in science. But he's saying that it has to always be tied to the data of the senses. That when you try to reason without the data of the senses or against the data of the senses, you are committing a logical fallacy of its own. So that, again, we're saying that this method of reasoning based on the senses is reason, and it is logic, and that it's actually illogical or unreasonable to try to reason without this data. And I may be totally wrong here, but it seems to me that that's the ultimate point. Does reason and logic have to operate on data from the senses? And can you end up concluding that anything is true using reason or logic without data from the senses, ultimately being the foundation and starting point of your analysis? I think Thomas Jefferson's phrasing can be defended because, put reason firmly in her seat and called at her tribunal every fact and everything. As long as you're understanding reason in the sense of a methodology that operates on the data of the senses, I think you're fine. It's only when you take this other approach of saying that reason and logic can just ultimately be divided from the data of the senses that you're into a world of speculation and nonsense and fantasy.
Yeah, to some extent, it's a question of how the sausage is made, isn't it? You've got your sausage making machine, but it's no good to have the machine if you don't have the pig to,
right.
To put into it, essentially. So from that point of view, I think the process is interesting and it's worth studying, and it has its place in the whole architecture of what we're talking about, but it doesn't have that prime position that the senses have, and it doesn't have the prime position that you rightly say Plato and the others would certainly give it, the Pythagoreans, so on.
Josh, we're going to begin to run long for today's episode, but if we can at least start looking at this final paragraph on page 124, I think this is part of answering the question that you're raising here, because what I'm seeing is the important part of this section is that DeWitt says, moreover, it is not in sensation, but in human intelligence that error arises. Of the sensations, he wrote, sensation is entirely irrational. And DeWitt says, this is not cited as a demerit, but as a merit, and it is the justification for regarding sensation as a criterion. It can't stimulate itself, and unlike reason, when stimulated by something external, cannot add anything or take anything away. And then DeWitt gives a number of examples here about seeing oxes and the color white and so forth. But I think the point of a lot of this leads us back to the distinguishing attribute of the canonical faculties is that they are irrational, is that they operate automatically, and it's the process of evaluation which we're considering to be where reason and logic and so forth take place. But ultimately, the point is that the reason the canonical faculties are reliable is that they're just simply giving us raw data that has not been filtered through opinion. Because this is where differences of opinion occurred even within the Epicurean school. And Diogenes Laertius records that this is the question of whether there are 3 legs of the canon of truth or whether there are 4. Because DeWitt says it is not sensation that tells the observer that he is seeing a white ox. This conclusion that you're seeing a white ox is a function of the intelligence. And this recognition is, quote, an immediate perception of the intelligence. And here's the point that I think is interesting to follow. Even to such a perception as this, the recognition that you're seeing a white ox, even to such a perception as this, Epicurus denied the rank of a criterion, though his successors did not. And the ground of his rejection is manifest. If the observer says it is a white ox, this is a judgment, and as such it is secondary to the sensation itself, and it can err. Thus it does not qualify as a criterion. The sensation, however, does not err. This is that whole issue as we're discussing anticipations or prolepsis or preconceptions. Is it ever justifiable for you to form a concept like an ox and decide that that ox concept is itself a criterion of truth? It seems to me that what DeWitt is saying is that Epicurus said, no, you reason that you're seeing a white ox in your mind, but you always have to keep in mind that you could be mistaken. The conclusion that something is a white ox is a conclusion of your mind that could be wrong. But the sensations, the things that you're seeing and touching and feeling and smelling are not wrong. They are just what you're experiencing.
Yeah. So when you asked me a moment ago what I thought about what you were talking about previously about how whether senses fundamentally report truth or fact or whether or not they err or they can never make mistakes, I hesitated because it's actually a question on which there's, I think, some diversity of opinion among, let's say, academic commentators who are living today. And you're far more familiar with that literature than I am. But it comes, this issue of like the square tower that looks round from far away. And there's all different kinds of ways of interpreting that sentence in a way that will defend the sensations as being worthy of being criteria.
There are actually counterexamples to what is the way it's formulated here by DeWitt, so that it cannot stimulate itself, or when stimulated by something external, cannot add anything or take anything away. So one I'm very familiar of myself is, unfortunately, are migraine auras. So they are generated after the picture has been produced on the retina and on the way into the brain. So at the early stage in the brain, so it's woven into the sensation. And if you don't know about auras, you cannot distinguish it. So it's part of an altered sensation if you have the migraine aura overlaid on what comes in from the retina. There are certainly, and I'm sure there were more counter examples. So it's not really, there are exceptions to this these statements which are put up here by DeWitt.
So Martin, you're saying you also suffer from migraine with like visual aura?
Yeah, only I don't have the pain normally. I only have migraine auras typically once a month. So and they definitely are there, directly interwoven with the sensation, and it's added to what because I know background, so I know. So this one has been added, but it's in such a way there that in principle I cannot distinguish it. So only my later processing, the mind can dismiss it as an artifact from this migraine aura.
Yeah, I actually suffer the same thing, probably not as frequently as once a month, but I do get this. It's caused by spreading cortical depression in the brain, which is an electrical phenomenon. That's as far as we think we know anyway. But you're right, this visual aura, and there's Wikipedia pages about this. People who don't experience this can go and see what it looks like. But the weird thing is about it, it's not dependent on your eyes and which way they're moving and whether they're open or not, right? If I were to close my eyes and move them left, move them right, the visual aura seems to stay in the same place because it exists in the brain.
But such early, so you cannot separate. So it's part of the sensation as you get.
Okay, now what I'm hearing both of you referring to there, that's going to lead back to another major part of the big picture, is that nature doesn't guarantee us success, either in thinking or necessarily in our perceptions. I mean, some people are born blind, some people go blind. The senses are not necessarily functioning all the time as we would like them to function. But the question would then be, how do we know that they're not functioning correctly? Is it just through abstract, pure logic that we know that they're not functioning correctly or the way that we would like them to, or without pain? It's because we can compare the functioning when they're malfunctioning, to other times when they are functioning without those distortions, I would think is the response to what you're saying. Again, so you don't know that aura is a problem because you've just contemplated pure reason in your thought and come up with that conclusion. You know it's a problem because there are times when it's not a problem. And you compare those sensations to each other and conclude that one of them is distorted and one of them is not.
Yeah. But here you have then an example that we dismiss as sensation.
In fact, Lucretius says, Epicurus says, you never dismiss a sensation. I don't mean to contradict exactly the way you've constructed that, but I think that's the point, is that the eyes do not contradict the ears, nor does one vision of the eye contradict another vision of the eye. They're both primary data that you have to accept under the condition that you've been given, because there's no way to go behind it. What your mind is doing is comparing multiple observations of those sensations, and over time, you begin to see that when your eyes are functioning without distortion, that you're producing a picture that you conclude to be true. And then you can compare it to those times when your eyes are not functioning properly, and you're going to conclude that in those times the picture you're getting is inaccurate. But you're never really dismissing the data from that sensation. You have to accept what you're given because you have no way to get behind it. The times when you have the aura or are experiencing the migraine headaches are just as real to you and just as primary data as the times when you're not. It's just that you don't make judgments about what color the ox is when you've got dark glasses on. You see what it looks like when you've got dark glasses on, and then later on you take off the dark glasses and you realize that the color changes. When you don't have the dark glasses on, it's a different color. And it's only comparing the sensations to each other that leads you to be able to say something is true or false. You just can't reason your way to that conclusion. only by comparing the data from the senses. Okay, tell me why I'm wrong there, if so.
No, actually, what I want to do is present another case that came to us from forum user Todd. He mentioned the issue of hallucinogenics, and I was hoping to get your opinion on that since you're on the subject. You're on quite a roll here.
Yeah. What did he say? I'd have to refresh myself as to the point you're making, Joshua. Do you remember the point that he brought up?
Well, your response to it vaguely at the time was that it's false to say that everything that is reported by our sensations is true, right? If I'm hallucinating and I see a dragon flying at me, my senses told me there's a dragon flying at me, therefore there's actually a dragon flying at me. That would be a misrepresentation of what's going on.
It would be a false conclusion.
Okay.
Yes. And, I am as bad about loose talk as anybody, and my ability to articulate things consistently and clearly is woefully insufficient. All sensations are true is a defensible position, but all conclusions based on sensation are true is absolutely not defensible. And so that's the direction you have to drill down, I think. If you're hallucinating, in fact, I think it's specifically stated in Lucretius that hallucinations and dreams are true in the sense that you are perceiving them in your mind. And you can't just simply say that they didn't happen. They weren't just put there supernaturally or whatever. They happened to you. But the conclusion that you draw from it has to be that it did not happen in the real world. It was just a dream, or it was just a hallucination. You should not conclude that a dragon actually flew at you or did whatever the suggestion was. It's these conclusions that are true or false. Opinions, conclusions, deductions, those are true and false, but the sensations are simply whatever they are. I think is the point. Now, again, I'm not an expert on this any more than anybody else is. I'm just reading the material too. But I think that would be a sympathetic way of explaining Epicurus' position. At least that's what I read, and would seem to be a plausible version, no matter who said it, whether it was DeWitt or Don or anybody else. But I can't remember any more detail about what Todd said. Do you remember any more?
I do remember it being specifically on the subject of psychedelics, but I think you've probably answered it fairly.
Yeah, and maybe given the time, we just need to wrap up the episode. But let me say this before we do closing comments from everybody. I think that's what it comes back down to. We have to have an understanding of all sensations are true that is reasonable and not absurd. And it is absurd to say that the things that we dream or the things that we hallucinate or we think we see, it is absurd to say that every one of those things is true in the sense of that's what actually happened to you in the big picture. But on the other hand, the things that your eyes report to you, your ears report to you, no matter how distorted, the things that you experience in a dream, if Lucretius and Epicurus are correct, they are raw data that has come into your mind from some source. And that raw data has to be accepted as it is, as raw data, because there's no way to get behind it. It's just those are the faculties that nature has given you to interface with reality. As you were talking about earlier, Joshua, you have no interface with reality other than these faculties. And you take the data that they give you, and then you evaluate the data, and there you make mistakes. You can be right, you can be wrong in determining what's accurate and what's not. But all sensations are true means that all sensations are honestly reported to you without evaluation and without any opinion from those faculties that nature gave you. And all this operation process of evaluating them is what takes place in your mind, and you are responsible. You may be sick. It may be beyond your control. You may have dark glasses on. You may be blindfolded. You may be blind. You may be deaf. You may be in the middle of a fog. You may have all sorts of obstacles to having all the information that you need. But in the end, you have to evaluate it, and that's in your mind where true or false occurs. I'm sorry for ranting like that. Let's talk about closing comments so we can bring the episode to a reasonable time length conclusion. Martin, any closing thoughts for the day?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Calasini?
Okay, so my closing comments are that this is important, even if there's a certain level of complexity that I find a little bit unpleasant. But it's important, everything that we're talking about here, because it has to do with how we come to think about that the gods are not supernatural, that the gods are not involved with human life, and how we think through all of that. So how we use observation, how we use reasoning to come to conclusions around that. So that's why this is important. And also regarding death, that after death, sensations cease, and how do we come to that conclusion? So it's very important to understand the process of thinking and the reasoning behind that.
Good points. Joshua?
Colosini's been talking a little bit about the Greek gods and their influence on how people think about these things. What I realized as I hear you talking, Colosini, is that I can now justify the reference that I seemingly made out of nowhere to American transcendentalism and the use of metaphor in the place of some of these other things like pure reason contemplating absolute truth, because Lucretius justifies the use of metaphor, particularly on the subject of the gods. The grain is Ceres and the wine is Bacchus and so forth. So there's that. One thing that I can probably say to sort of tie up the episode here is that, you know, if you picture the fictional character most associated with logic, most associated with reason and those processes, I'd nominate Sherlock Holmes for that position, right? But when Sherlock Holmes doesn't have enough information for reason or logic to act upon, what's his response? Well, in the books, he says, data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. There you go. We could have skipped a whole hour and a half if I'd said
That's
that.
exactly right. Or as Diogenes Laertius says about Epicurus, you wait. It's in one of the principal doctrines as well, those long ones that seem so convoluted about how to think. You do not select a single opinion as true if you don't have sufficient evidence to justify it. If the evidence supports several conclusions, you have to keep open the possibility that one or all of those simultaneously possible conclusions are also true. As Frances Wright says in her book, if you observe that the sun rises every morning immediately after a horse-drawn chariot ascends into the sky, then you're going to conclude that the horse-drawn chariot ascending into the sky was somehow related to the sun rising. You have to follow the evidence that's before you, but you don't create evidence in your mind without data from the senses. Okay, so we'll wait until next week for further discussion. We haven't finished this chapter yet. Hopefully we'll finish it next week. As long as we continue to have interesting discussions about it, we'll continue to dive deeper. So thanks for your time today. We'll come back next week. See you then, and join us on EpicureanFriends.com in the meantime. Bye.